Okay, in this video I will explore the first part of my geography lesson in première called the spatial distribution of production in the world. So in an introduction in class we have already defined some very important notions such as production, globalization, economy, and we have already examined most of part 1a. So the video will be about the entire part 1, which is entitled A Greater Number of Countries Are Involved in the Production of Global Wealth. And in fact, in this part I will try to expose the role and the level of integration of various types of countries in the world depending on their level of economic advancement, or we could also say of economic development. So part A introduces a notion called the global shift, which applies to an important trend in the changing geography of production, a trend that has been going on for the last 30 years approximately. So to start with, two maps that propose a description of how distributed is the wealth per capita in the world. So GDP per capita is a way to measure the average level of income of the population of a country. And in fact, there are two ways to measure and consider the GDP per capita. On this map, the value which is considered is called GDP per capita by PPP, which means by purchasing power parity. And so in fact the calculation of wealth with this map is based on an adjustment which is an adjustment to the uneven cost of life that exists in the world. Life is more expensive in very rich countries such as the USA, Norway, or Qatar, and much cheaper in the less developed countries. So if you take into account these differences and adjust GDP to this situation, then you have GDP per capita by PPP, which is a good way to measure the standards of living in the world. And even by considering purchasing power parity, we can see that there are some countries which are definitely rich, mostly situated in the northwest hemisphere, I mean North America, Western Europe, and also Japan, some countries of the Middle East, and Australia and New Zealand mostly. With this map, which is about the same period of time, the GDP is now calculated in US dollars. And in fact, all countries of the world do not use the US dollar. Many currencies of the world, currency is the name given to the type of money which is used in one country. So many currencies in the world have a lower value than the dollar. And so if we consider the financial value of the wealth which is produced in each country of the world and not adjust these measures to the cost of life in each country, then we find much wider inequalities. And so the gap between what we still call the North or the developed countries, so again North America, Western Europe, Japan, Australia, and the rest of the world, this gap is still pretty impressive. In fact, one of the important statements about inequality in the world is that economic inequalities are wider than human development inequalities. Said another way, inequalities in income are wider than inequalities in living conditions. In any case, with both maps, we see how uneven is the spread of wealth in the world. And so, yes, wealth and the productivity of wealth is still much higher in a couple of economies which are located in what we call the developed world. But this is a situation that is slowly changing. Well, slowly. At the scale of the history of mankind, it's not slow what is happening at the moment. It's rather fast. Considering only the HICs, the high-income countries that I have mentioned so far, back in the early 1990s, they used to produce 60% of the global GDP, so more than half. Today, it's a bit less. Today, the high-income countries produce only 45% of the world GDP, with the USA representing 25% of the global GDP at the moment. And what has changed is the emergence of new economic powers that we sometimes call emerging countries or newly industrialized countries, who have experienced a fast economic growth during the last 3 decades. And by far the most important is China. China is now the second GDP in the world. And if we measure GDP by purchasing power parity, by PPP, China is already the biggest economy in the world. With this pie chart here, you can see a description of the distribution of wealth per country, and you can see how much a small number of countries in the world concentrate most of the production of wealth. China plus the USA, that are sometimes nicknamed the Big Two, represent approximately 40%. And if you consider the 20 largest economies in the world, which meet every year in an international summit that is called the G20, there you have 90% of the world's GDP. So clearly what has changed during the last 30 years is the emergence of some economies that have experienced this big growth. So China is the most impressive, but we could also add countries like South Africa, Brazil, India. These 4 countries plus Russia form another international meeting called the BRICS. By the way, it's quite famous. The expression is quite famous. And the result is the top list that we have today. It is something we saw in class. We saw this history of the GDP by country, how it changed since the 1960s, and viewed that the emergence of China, which is pretty recent actually, mostly during the last 20 years, was something extremely impressive. Since last time's class, I found this graph which summarizes in a way what we saw with the animated graph. There are several observations that you can make with this graph. You can see that all these big economies of the world, they have been growing for the last 40 years. It has been the most impressive period of economic growth in world history, actually. And the advance of the USA in the size of its economy has been confirmed. There's a larger gap, at least in real numbers, in real value, between the economy of the USA and the economy of the other rich countries like Japan, Germany, the UK, France or Italy. By the way, one element we must also take into consideration is the population of these countries. The USA is much more populated than Japan or Germany, more than 3 times more populated. So in fact, the fact that it is 3 times richer is not that illogical. And the US population has grown more significantly than the population of Germany or the UK, and certainly more than the population of Japan. As you can see, Japan's GDP is decreasing, and it is because the population of Japan is decreasing. But the recent emergence of China, which is a real economic boom, is clearly the most impressive change that must be considered if we look at the recent economic history of the world. And so, summarizing the geography of the world economy is something that is difficult, because the situation is constantly changing. Basically, what we can say that back in the beginning of the 90s, the 1990s, so 30 years ago, it was pretty clear that the world was mostly divided into 2 groups, 2 types of economies: the developing and the developed world, the poor and the rich, the south and the north. The north being the rich industrialized countries, the south being the poor, not industrialized countries. And the changes we have observed on the previous graph have led to a change in this geography. And nowadays, we mostly consider that there are 3 groups, 3 categories of economy: the high-income countries, the rich, which are in red here; the middle-income countries, a kind of transitory situation, which are in green, dark and light green on this map; and still very underdeveloped are the low-income countries, which are mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. This division into 3 is what is suggested by a United Nations agency called the World Bank, and it's the classification I am going to use now. And if the north-south divide is not as pertinent anymore, if the levels of development in the world are more diverse today than 30 years ago, it is because the geography of production is nowadays more complex and more widely spread in the world. So it is more widely spread, but it is still pretty unevenly distributed. Some statistics are impressive. I mentioned a couple of minutes ago the fact that China plus USA equals 40% of the world GDP, that the G20 represents 90% of the world GDP. On the map that you can see here, the 2 maps actually, you can observe this uneven distribution of wealth. To understand this map, you must realize that obviously the shape of the countries is altered on these maps because they are what we call cartograms. A cartogram is the map where the size of the country is proportional to a certain value which is given. And these 2 cartograms are about population at the top and GDP at the bottom. The size of a population is an important element in the calculation of the size of an economy. Obviously, a very populated country will have a larger economic weight, a larger GDP, than a less populated country with the same standards of living. So the fact that Asia, and in particular East Asia, is the most populated area in the world, obviously plays a great role in the economic weight of East Asia nowadays. The standards of living in East Asia, notably in China, are not as high as in the USA, for example. Japan or South Korea are as advanced as the USA, but China is not. But the combination of China's economic development and its population is the reason why China is one of the big two. And so the poverty of another continent, namely Africa, is made pretty visible on this map. In fact, you must realize that the USA is 5 times as rich as the continent of Africa in real GDP. So it's really impressive. The result of all these changes is that nowadays we tend to see 3 big economic areas in the world, what we call the 3 cores of the global economy. They are North America, Western Europe, and East Asia. And the emergence of East Asia has been the main aspect of the recent economic history. And this changing distribution of production to the profit of East Asia is what we call the global shift. And in fact, the global shift is particularly visible if we consider one aspect of the production of economy, which is the production of manufactured goods. So in other words, the activity of factories, or said another way, the activity of production of material goods. On this map you can see with the circles what is the size of the manufacturing production of the countries of the world. And here the importance of East Asia is even more impressive than on the previous cartogram, because we really focus on this aspect of the economy where things have changed very significantly for East Asia during the last 30 years. And with the colors of the circles, you can see that industrial activity is declining in many countries of Europe and also in Canada, but it is certainly growing very fast in East Asia, where all the circles are red. And with these tables here, I would like to take an example to illustrate that fact. These graphs are about motorcar production in the world, and we can compare the year 2018 to the year 1985. So 1985 is on the right side of the screen now. The USA and Japan were in those days by far the biggest producers of cars in the world. They were the only 2 countries that could produce more than 10 million cars a year. And in this graph you could still see the domination of the countries of the G7, the 7 richest countries of the 80s: USA, Japan, Germany, France, Canada, Spain, the UK. Only South Korea was in this top list. And the overall production of cars used to be 50 million cars a year in the world. Now look at the left. In 2018, the world produced almost 100 million cars, which is something very it's a different world actually. We produce almost twice as many cars as we did back in 1995. It's very impressive. It says a lot about the change in the standards of living, and it also says a lot about the environmental problems that are connected with this economic growth. What is also very clear is that production of cars in the USA or Japan has stagnated, and it has even reduced in Japan. But China has multiplied its car production by almost 20. It used to produce 1.4 million cars 30 years ago, 25 years ago, and it is now producing almost 28 million cars a year. India has also multiplied its car production by 5. So you can see with this type of production a very clear example of the global shift and the fast emergence of Asia. Now, in part B, I will examine in greater detail the role played by various types of countries in the global economy. Before considering the current situation, I would like to do a little bit of economic history, or more exactly present to you a model to understand economic development that was provided in the 1960s by an American economist called Walter Rostow. And what he has described is more or less what has happened, notably in the countries of East Asia, of which we have already talked a lot. So Rostow defines economic development as being a logical evolution starting from a traditional society, a traditional economy, what most countries used to have before the 18th century. So an economy based on subsistence farming, an economy based on a very low level of economic growth, but communities trying to survive with an economy mostly based on the production of food. And he then considers an economic takeoff taking place in the countries that are affected by the Industrial Revolution. And this economic takeoff is really based on the introduction of new techniques, the techniques of the modern industry, of the manufacturing industries, the use of more modern technology, the beginning of factory production. And that is for him the transitory model of economic development. And then, after a couple of decades, these countries that have industrialized drive to maturity by diversifying their economy, notably by introducing more services. And this leads to societies of high mass consumption. So the French and British economies are like this today, where people are mostly wealthy, I mean by world standards, of course, and so can buy many services and goods, and this is how the economy works. So this trend explained by Rostow is a trend of drive to modernity, from traditional to modern economy, and for Rostow, the introduction of the manufacturing industry is what changed everything for the countries that experienced that. Another way to measure the level of economic development of a country is to refer to the employment structure of an economy. And in fact, this Clark-Fisher model is very strongly linked with the Rostow model. It's just a different way to look at it. So we must recall what are these several sectors of the economy: primary, secondary, tertiary, and even for some economists, a quaternary sector. So the primary sector of the economy consists in retrieving raw materials. So it means the mining industry and all the production of crops, like cereals, grains, fruits, etc., which is definitely the economic sector dominant in the traditional economies. And it is still, for example, you can see this pie chart here, the economic sector which clearly dominates the economy of a low-income country such as Ethiopia, where 75% of the people that work, or what we call the labor force, still work in the primary sector, so mostly in the fields. The secondary sector is about the manufacturing production and the construction industry. And so it is the sector which is really the object of the industrial revolutions. The countries that are currently industrializing are those where the share of the secondary sector in the labor force is the highest. It's the case of China today. In China, the secondary sector, so construction and manufacturing, represents approximately 1/3 of the labor force of the country, which is clearly the highest level that can be reached. Then you have the tertiary sector, which represents services, and services is the production of immaterial things, and the development of services, so banking, insurance, health, education, always comes with industrialization. But when countries are very advanced economically, like for example the UK, but I could have chosen the USA or France, then the service sector becomes the one which is overwhelmingly dominant in the labor force. And this is where the UK is now. So as you can see on the line graph, there are some economics that also talk about the quaternary sector of the economy. By quaternary, they mean all the activities that are activities of knowledge at a high level. People that don't work with their hands but work in a very high level of production of knowledge and production of decisions. So basically it means the managers of the important industries, the people that govern, the people that are in the high level education in university, and the engineers. So mostly all the people that really work mostly with their brains, with a kind of dominant position in the economy. But okay, all economists do not consider the quaternary sector to be very pertinent, so let's not examine this in greater detail. And now I will present to you some screenshots that I have taken from a very interesting website which is called the Observatory of Economic Diversity. So it does not sound very sexy, I admit, but in fact it's quite a fascinating website as long as you are interested a little bit in international trade. International trade nowadays represents 1/3 of the global economy. What this means is that 1/3 of the things that are produced are exported to another country. And all countries are not evenly involved in this global trade. They do not participate in the same way. In other words, there is a certain specialization of some types of countries in some types of production. So to introduce this point, I would like to show you how distributed is the export of some specific products. So here on this graph, the topic is the trade of large aircraft. So in other words, big planes and helicopters. It's a high-tech industry that we have studied in the case study about Airbus. And what you can see with this graph is that by far Europe is the biggest exporter of large aircrafts, and France ranks first. Only Europe and a little bit of North America really export aircrafts. The presence of Asia in red, Africa in yellow is really limited because they do not produce a lot of aircraft, or for Asia and China in particular, if they produce some aircraft, they keep it for themselves. So you have an example of a kind of product where the countries of Western Europe clearly have an advance in expertise, and they dominate this market at global level. Now here is another example, something much more common, which is a personal computer. And what we can see here is how important is the dominance of China in this sector. 80% of the computers in the world have been assembled in China and exported from China. So it's a domination which is clearly explained by all the assets of China here. Notably, it's very numerous and cheap labor force, and so it's a type of product for which China is very, very competitive. And basically, this is what China is very good at the moment: is exporting material goods that are used for everybody, from toys to many electronic devices, etc. And now here is something completely different: cocoa beans. So we are really speaking about a crop, something, a product of farming. And here you can see, on the contrary, the domination of African countries in yellow, notably two of them, Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, which really dominate this market. These are by far the main exporters of cocoa beans, and I used it to show that the poor countries of the world are in fact only really present in the global economy as exporters of raw materials. It does not mean that they are the only exporters of raw materials or crops, but it means that raw materials or crops are the only thing for which they are a little bit competitive. And in fact, to illustrate this point, keep in mind this graph for the exports of cocoa beans, and now consider the export of chocolate. So chocolate is not a crop. Chocolate is something that is manufactured. Chocolate is made in workshops or in factories. And in fact, the exports of chocolate are mostly done, and by far, by European countries. African countries do not export a lot of chocolate. In fact, what happens in this industry is that African countries export cocoa beans, but the chocolate is mostly made in rich countries of Europe because it demands factories with a rather high level of technology, actually, and these factories, they do not exist in Africa massively nowadays. So this was an introduction to this diversity of involvement of the countries regarding their level of economic development. Now let's have a look at 4 categories. And in the first category, I would like to talk about the countries which are difficult to classify, because they are really specialized in something. There are some countries which benefit from what we call a very specific comparative advantage. They have an advantage on the others on some specific aspect of the economy because of some of their geographic elements. Brazil is a pertinent example of that. The competitive advantage of Brazil is the size of this country. It is so large that it can produce a lot of raw materials, notably minerals, and a lot of crops as well. So on this graph here, you can see the types of products that are exported by Brazil. And I would like you to note also the total value of the exports of Brazil. It's written in the middle, and it's $219 billion of exports for the year 2017. So it's important to note it because you will be able to compare that value with the value of other countries later. And what does Brazil export? Well, in brown you can see some minerals and also some metals. And in yellow and in green you can see crops. So crops are really massively exported by Brazil, so much that Brazil is nicknamed the farm of the world because it combines the existence of very large farmlands and of a modern industrial type of farming, which gives Brazil this advantage. We may note that Brazil is also an industrializing country, so it can also export some manufactured goods. Another example, perhaps more obvious here, is Saudi Arabia. Well, Saudi Arabia benefits from massive reserves in oil, and in fact its role in the global economy is mostly an exporter of crude petroleum, that is to say raw oil. It's an example of the small number of oil-rich countries of the Middle East, such as the Arab Emirates or Qatar, whose economy was really based on this, even though they are getting to greater diversity nowadays, because they know that they have to do so. Now I will talk about the rich countries, the HICs. And what I want you to understand is that they are the countries which have the most diverse and the most competitive economies. I insist on that because we often hear in the media that a country like France suffers a lot from the competition of the rest of the world. It is excessive to say that. France suffers much less than other countries of the competition of the world and has kept a certain competitiveness. So just to recall, this is a map which shows the HICs of the world according to the West Bank. They are in dark blue here, and in light blue you can see some states which have are named former high-income economies, and there are indeed some states that are less rich by world standard than they used to be. It's not to be the case of Russia and Argentina. So here is an example, the UK. First of all, look at the value of the exports of the UK. It's almost $400 billion, so it's twice as big as the exports of Brazil. And if we look at what the UK is actually exporting, you can see that some things that were exported by Brazil are almost absent here. And what dominates is manufactured goods. Many machines in dark blue, many vehicles in light blue, and also many chemicals in pink here. What makes Britain a bit special is that it is also able to export some oil, because there is some oil in the North Sea. And now look at France. So France has, like Britain, a very diverse economy when it comes to exports. Like Britain, machines and vehicles dominate. Chemicals are also very important, and the economy of France is marked by a larger diversity than that of Britain, because France is also able to export a lot of food. and also a lot of wine. So this is what makes France a bit specific. But France is one of the most diverse economies in the world. France is competitive in many different types of exports. Looking at the value of the French exports, you may see that they are clearly more expensive, greater value than that of Britain, because it's more than $500 billion. This difference is because this value is really for exports of material goods. And Britain gets a lot of its wealth from the service sector, notably the finance sector, more than France. So it explains the difference between the two. So we have here two HICs which demonstrate that they are very competitive in high technology. That is to say, the activities that demand a lot of skilled labor, of research, of capital, and they are marked by this diversity. One of the assets that they have, in contrast with most other countries in the world, is also the very good level of infrastructures, of transport, communication, electricity, water, that exists in our rich countries. It costs a lot of money, but it's mostly for the benefit not only of the standards of living but also of the competitiveness. Okay, the roads are good, there is electricity everywhere, so that is also a big asset for these rich economies. A last example of an HIC is South Korea. I chose it because it's a more recent HIC. I mean, 50 years ago, South Korea was not a rich country. It is one of the countries which have industrialized very fast in the second part of the 20th century, and you can see now how big are its imports, both in value, almost $600 billion, and in types which are really mostly about machines, electronic machines, and vehicles, and chemicals as well. So they are also extremely advanced in the pathway of economic development. Now let's look at the transitory countries, those that are called by the World Bank the middle income countries, but that I will call here with another perspective as the newly industrialized countries, or NICs. And what they are mostly is that they are the rising factories of the world. So I'm showing again this map that indicates where these newly industrialized countries are. There are mostly the countries in dark and light green here on this map. It is important to take a historical perspective to understand what's happening in these countries. This strange document is a document that summarizes how the economic development of East Asia has happened since the 1950s. So you must read it from the bottom left corner to the top right corner. The idea is that industrial activities and economic development have spread in this region of the world, starting from Japan to the rest of the continent. And so historically, back in 1955, only Japan was starting to have an economy that was getting industrialized, and that, in addition to farming, started to be competitive in the metal industry. And a bit later, Japan started to make textile, so garment, clothing, and to export it. And progressively, Japan began to do some electronic devices and to export them. And once Japan, in the 60s and 70s, began to be very competitive in electronics, well, it was not competitive enough for textile because the standards of living in Japan had become too high. And so it was a better idea to produced textile in cheaper countries, and South Korea in those days was a cheaper country. And so was China. So by the late 70s, textile industry had left Japan and had reached China and South Korea. In this time, the level of technological advancement of Japan was still increasing, and that of China and South Korea was increasing too. So progressively in the 90s, even China and South Korea were becoming competitive in electronics. So where to do textile at that moment? Well, new countries became attractive to the textile industry because they could propose cheap labor force, and this is why Vietnam became progressively an industrializing country in the beginning of the 21st century. And Vietnam is even today moving on to the higher level where they can produce some manufactured goods with electronic devices. And the situation at present time is that the textile industry, which, as you understand, is often the first industry to enter a country, the textile industry is now very present in Bangladesh. So this pattern is nicknamed the Flying-Geese pattern because it's as if Japan had led all the other East Asian countries on the pathway to economic development. So it is a bit caricatural, but it is very commonly used to summarize the economic development of East Asia. So where are we now? Now we have this exceptional country in the geography of the economy of the world, which is China. China is clearly a newly industrialized country, but China is so big that it can do more or less anything nowadays. Of course, it is an economic monster. It's populated by 1.4 billion people, and it has experienced clearly the most impressive economic growth in the history of mankind in a very short period of time. You may remember the value of exports of France. France exports for $500 billion. China exports for $2.4 trillion. So it is clearly a much bigger exporter. And they have a very diverse type of exports, where electronic machines dominate, but where textile is still important, because you have in China some cities and some companies that are extremely advanced and extremely rich, but you also still have some poor workers who accept very low wages and work in the textile industry. So China has not yet become an HIC where the textile industry would have disappeared. Not at all. But it is in this transitory situation, and in fact it is so big that its weight in the global economy is what we have seen so far. So manufactured goods dominate, and it's not China is not yet very competitive on the high-tech industry. At least it does not export its high tech. It still imports. Planes, for example. But this is probably going to change in the future decade. Now, another country which is a good example of what a newly industrialized country is Turkey. Much smaller economy. It exports for 166 billion. And we yet have more or less the same, not the same, but a comparable diversity to that of China. You have some electronic machines, some textile, but we can see that the simple manufactured goods, so textile, cars, metal, dominates, and certainly not the high-tech. So this is another example of a newly industrialized country. let's go back to Vietnam to see. Let's go back to Asia. I mean, to see with Vietnam how clear is the industrialization of Vietnam. Vietnam exports for $220 billion, which is equivalent to the exports of Brazil. So it's absolutely not nothing. You can see the lesser advance of Vietnam here, maybe in the white part of the textile, and the fact that Vietnam still exports quite a lot of raw materials. So it is less industrialized than Turkey, for example. And here comes Bangladesh. So in my introduction to this part, I have said that Bangladesh is one of the most recently industrializing countries of East Asia. It is, we could say, a newly industrialized country, and we can see that the exports of Bangladesh are overwhelmingly dominated by textile. It is not the biggest textile exporter in the world, it's China, but it is the country whose exports are mostly dominated by textile, because the only competitiveness of Bangladesh today is its numerous and cheap labor force. And this is what the textile industry needs. Cheap workers in great numbers. It's not very demanding in technology, but it is demanding in people, and in particular women. Well, you have here a very different kind of newly industrialized country, one of the newest, one of the first levels of industrialization. And looking at the exports of Bangladesh in value, you can see that with almost $40 billion, this type of product, the textile, is not something that creates a lot of wealth. You can't become very rich nowadays with only textile. Now let's turn to the last category of countries, which is the category of low-income countries. So we are here talking about the countries which have a very low level of industrialization, and which are, as we can see here, mostly located in sub-Saharan Africa in blue. So we are going to focus on a country of the east of Africa, which is called Ethiopia. And Ethiopia is the second most populated country in Africa. So it has a certain economic weight in the world. And these are the exports of Ethiopia. So two things must be highlighted, or maybe three. First thing, the fact that, like most LICs, Ethiopia's exports mostly consist in crops and raw materials. By the way, if we look at these crops, you can see that two things are particularly dominant. Coffee. So it's not a crop which is essential to life, is it? It is a luxury product once it is transformed. And you also have cut flowers, and this is always something that is very striking to me. We are speaking with Ethiopia of a country where 20% of the population suffers from, if not famine, starvation. And the country exports cut flowers because you can make some money out of cut flowers. But it feeds nobody directly. What is the second interesting point is that the value of Ethiopia's exports is very low compared to all the values we have seen so far, $2.2 billion, because you don't make a lot of money out of these products, and it shows how much the countries of Africa are not massively integrated in the global economy. Their role in value is very, very low compared to the biggest economies of the world. And we are talking of a very populated country of, if I'm not wrong, more than 100 million people. So more populated than Germany, for example. And the third thing that we can observe is that there is some blue and green colors in this graph of exports, which shows that Ethiopia has started to export some manufactured goods, and in particular, of course, textile. All which is in green on this graph is textile. So that is the proof that industrialization has started in Ethiopia. And this is done in some industrial estates, which are located here on this map in green. So some very limited zones where you have some factories, which are mostly textile factories. And what is interesting is that all these factories are almost owned by foreign companies, in particular Chinese companies. That is the reason why you can see this kind of ceremony of workers, so women actually, working in textile factories owned by Chinese investors. And what they are doing actually is some daily gymnastics before working, which is a frequent practice in Chinese companies. So this picture was taken in an industrial estate called Hawassa in the south of the country, which is an example of how foreign investments in an LIC like Ethiopia is coming thanks to globalization. I mean, this is really globalization. We have here a good example of how the manufacturing production is spreading in the world. What you must know is that in order to obtain these investments, the Ethiopian government has provided a lot of services to attract the companies, and these services are what we call incentives, something that motivates an investor. These incentives can be low levels of taxation, and notably low tariffs on imports. In fact, all these industrial parks are what we call in economic geography special economic zones. That is to say, zones where the law is very business friendly in order to attract foreign direct investments, what we also call FDIs. So maybe creating special economic zones is the way a country can become industrial. In fact, they had been created in China 30 years ago, the same kind of zones, and it worked pretty well. But there is also a kind of tragic dimension to this, because the reason why textile industries are being settled in poor countries is because they are poor. It is what is illustrated with this picture, this cartoon, which shows the CEO of H&M explaining that H&M is leaving China for Ethiopia because once you can buy an H&M product, it means that you cannot produce it anymore. You are too expensive as a worker. And in fact, it was not difficult for me to find in the Ethiopian press some facts about the very difficult working conditions and the very low wages which are given to the workers in Hawassa, because it is precisely the reason why they are employed, because they are cheap. And by the way, productivity is not that good in the Ethiopian special economic zones, so it is not a very strong beginning for an industrialization. Anyway, many governments of the developing world are following this strategy that had been successfully followed by China, which means to attract first of all, investment in manufacturing activities where you can propose cheap labor. These activities, which are mostly the textile industry, are what we call labor-intensive activities. It means that what you need is labor. You don't need a lot of machines, a lot of money. You need labor. You need cheap workers. And this is how some countries of Africa are nowadays trying to attract investments. But apart from some countries in North Africa like Morocco and of course the south of Africa, which is more integrated, well, it's only a very, very beginning for Africa. And a way to illustrate that that difficulty for most African economies is to see the balance between the exports and the imports of Ethiopia. And in fact, it is absolutely not balanced precisely. Ethiopia imports much more than it exports. So Ethiopia is very dependent, is not making a lot of money at the moment. Why does Ethiopia import so much? But because Ethiopia does not produce a lot of manufactured products, so most of the manufactured products in Ethiopia are imported. And the irony of this is that they are mostly imported from China. Because the reason why some Chinese companies have massively invested in Ethiopia is because the Ethiopian government is giving them low tariffs. So the result of that is that the Ethiopian economy is being filled up with products from China. And so at the moment, investing in Ethiopia for China is something which is good for the exports of China, which is an example of how dominant and how powerful is the big economy of China in the world today. So yes, globalization is probably a good deal for many small economies of the world, which are taking off at the moment thanks to it. But it's not only positive, and there is a downside, which is that the competition is very difficult and often very unfair. So what we have seen in this first part is that globalization is something that involves all countries of the world, maybe, but at very uneven levels of integration. And as a conclusion, we need to make a presentation about some important terms that will be used in geography during the next 2 years by you and me. In fact, depending on their level of success and level of integration, we can clearly make a difference between two types of areas. The cores, which are very integrated, and the peripheries, which are the less integrated. So here is a more complete definition of what a core is. It is a rich area, populated, dynamic, powerful, and attractive and accessible area. So, in other words, an area that combines all the assets and all the and most of the positive aspects of economic development. And a core is also often a hub. It works together. That is to say, a central part of a network in the global economy which emits and attracts massive flows. So France is definitely a core. Europe is definitely a core. We will see other examples in a minute. A periphery is the contrary. A periphery is an area which is poorer, more isolated, and whose economy is stagnating or even sometimes in decline, because a periphery may suffer, in fact, from what we call the backwash effect of the success of the cause. It suffers from the competition, it suffers from the gap in economic power with the cause of the world. In between, you have many areas of the world which are in this kind of transitory situation of being semi-peripheries. So it's this transitory level which have experienced most newly industrialized countries. They are experiencing it now, actually, which means that they are benefiting from what we call the trickle-down effect of the success of the cause, which it's a theory that works not always bad in geography, even though it is very debatable in economics, which is that at one point the wealth of a core can spread in another area through investments in particular. And so semi-peripheries, thanks to a certain competitiveness and accessibility, have attracted some of the money of the world and are developing thanks to that. So, who are the cores, who are the semi-peripheries, and who are the peripheries of the world? So the cores are, in types of countries, what we call the high-income or developed countries, like France or the USA. The semi-peripheries are what the World Bank calls the middle-income countries, what we also call the newly industrialized or emerging countries. They apply to the same group. And as peripheries, I would say that the low-income countries, also known as least developed countries, are concerned. So I apologize for this abundant vocabulary, but indeed these expressions are some kinds of synonyms that can appear in articles, in documents, and so it's important that you know their existence and their equivalence. And so, to summarize the cause of the global economy, if we really consider regions and countries, are the USA, Western Europe, and increasingly East Asia. Semi-peripheries of the world would rather be Latin America, the Middle East, and the North and the South of Africa. South Asia, which includes Bangladesh, India, is located perhaps somewhere in between, and Sub-Saharan Africa will today be clearly identified as the main periphery of the global economy. So this was in a bit more than 1 hour, the presentation of this first part of the chapter about the spatial distribution of economic production and wealth at world level.